Welcome to the Mormon Medium Podcast, where we'll talk about spirituality, the paranormal, religion, and my journey in becoming a Mormon medium. I'm Nanette Ride. Thanks for listening. Now let's go have some fun.
Don't be afraid. Close your eyes. There's a moon overhead, but the sun will rise. Blood on our lips, such a poisonous bite. The sound of our hearts go bump, bump, bump in the night.
Hello and welcome to the Mormon Medium Podcast. Please be warned that on today's episode, we will be discussing sensitive mental health topics, including depression and suicide. Please know that you are loved, and if you are considering suicide, have suicidal ideations, or know someone who is, please get help. Talk to a trusted friend, a mental health professional, or you can call the suicide helpline by dialing 988.
Welcome to the podcast. Today we have a special guest. He's a returning guest and friend, Justin Stum. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He also deals with clients that have PTSD, depression, and other types of mental health issues, right?
Absolutely.
What else do you do? You do EMDR and like all kinds of other certifications.
He's basically
right?
a mental health god.
He's a god.
That's a little much, but I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming back. You are just a wealth of information, and we just love having you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, today we wanted to invite Justin in and talk about some very sensitive topics. The area we live in, St. George, Utah, has had several people who have committed suicide in the recent months. And we think that this is something that really deserves some attention.
And actually, I just learned from Justin that in this realm, committed suicide is not the verbiage that we use. It's, what is it, Justin?
And died by suicide.
Died by suicide.
Oh.
So, you know how they're changing the verbiage of almost everything around these days. So it's died by suicide. That's more proper for us to say.
Got it.
And you weren't here during that part
No, I wasn't.
of the conversation.
Why is that, Justin?
That's a good question. I think my perception on that, it may vary by the respondent. I think for me, at least my comprehension of it is it helps reduce stigma and shame in the surviving family members, and it creates some grace around the individual who's passed. As we think of committed, many people, those I've either treated personally who have passed dying by suicide, typically are not in a condition to commit, if you will. When we're hurting that much, a suicide in itself is less about ending your life and more about removing yourself from pain. And so I think as they've changed some of the language there, at least in terms of how we reference it in mental health, that provides, like I said, some grace for the family and some room for the individual who's passed to say that they died by suicide. Committed, I think, holds some shame and stigma there that would prevent families from healing in some way.
Interesting. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, and there's a lot of shame and stigma around it already, right? Mm-hmm. Like families are embarrassed to say, oh, well, he died by suicide. You don't ever see that in an obituary. You see he passed away suddenly or unexpectedly because there is a lot of shame associated there. And there really shouldn't be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's going on? What's your take on what's going on? Why so much of it, especially, I mean, we're seeing a lot of children that are doing this and they get so dark and so hopeless. And what do you think is the cause, and what can we do to help?
I think it's going to vary. I could speak maybe more directly at things that are within my purview. I visited with a professional in the community here within the last month or so who interfaced with two individuals who died by suicide. That was within the last 2 weeks for me as a licensed therapist. And then there were two young men in the community who died by suicide on Mother's Day.
Oh.
Which is so hard.
So hard for the mamas.
Yeah, super difficult.
Yeah.
So hard. So as I consider your question, Nan, and look at those four circumstances, two of which I'm a little more familiar with, but not entirely, I think we have to consider the contextual factors that are happening for those individuals in addition to things that we don't know that they were experiencing. I think the discussion around what death means, what shame means, what stigma means, what comparison and contrast means as we consider social media. I think the world is unfolding in some beautiful ways, but with the advent of technology and some of the increased pressures, particularly among 3 of those 4 that I'm mentioning, two were adults, one a young adult, the other 2 teens.
Wow.
And so I think that there's an increased pressure. I don't know that it's as linear as saying it's about comparing and social media. And so they took that direction as much as it is. I think there's a lot more exposure to what it means to terminate your life in that way, death by suicide. And so I think it becomes more common, which does have some problematic pieces. But on the flip side, I think there's some beauty in the public discussion, because we can become more educated and have discussions long before we get to a place where we need to exit as a result or in an attempt to get out of pain.
Right.
And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it varies by individual. I think the important piece of that is noting that it's more public.
Right.
And that there's less shame around it, which is beautiful. But in those public discussions, it also becomes, per my estimation, more of an option.
Interesting.
It's a little more common. It's not something that is swept under the rug and hushed. It's something that people are more openly talking about, the surviving families and what's coming up for them.
So, Justin, in a situation where someone may be considering ending their life, what are things that those of us around them might be able to look for or watch for? Are there, I mean, people talk about, there are signs or there's not signs, it's just going to happen. Is there something that we can do to help?
There's a lot of things we can do. The difficulty, I think, with that particular, with your question, not with the question, but with the inferences in that, is that a lot of those things aren't talked about, right? Individuals who are having feelings that they want to separate from family or from their community or from the planet altogether aren't having discussions about it typically. I think of individuals that I've personally treated over the last 20 plus years, and I've had unfortunately, a small handful of people that I've come to know very intimately who have died in that way. And as I think about my experience with them as a clinician, but as I engage, those aren't part of our discussion. And when they are, it's, no, that's not happening. I wouldn't do that to my family. I wouldn't do that to me. But clearly that was happening. That was a part of one of their options. And so I think as we look to that, it's considering, and maybe that's where we turn the discussion here a little bit per Brad's question, and that's to look a little more directly at what some of those signs and symptoms are that would at least communicate or give us some indication that there's some suicidal ideation. And when we say ideation, we're talking about cognitions or thought processes that contribute to someone's thinking due to a motive, current emotions, and then a plan, that it's moving beyond just light thoughts that they're having a hard day and they'd rather not be alive. It's moving into, this may be something I'm considering I might even have a plan to do that. And so to be spoken a little more directly about your question, I think some of it is, some of the pieces that we would be looking for would be, and these it would be more commensurate with depression than they would be suicide. But typically as we think about major depression and other mental health conditions that would promote someone's dying by suicide, we would look at social withdrawal. It's something that we could look for, at least early on. And that is their pulling away. We might look at become aware of the activities they're participating in that they once enjoyed. If you really enjoyed college football, Brad, for example, and it looks like that you're no longer, you've pulled away, it's really intermittent. You're invited over to games with the guys and you're not participating. And Nan might be saying, hey, that's really different. Brad's watched football.
So change in behavior.
Yes.
A change in behavior and a change in habits. Right? Normal things that you normally would do. In my energy balancing brain and my psychic medium brain, I have so many questions for you.
Oh, do you? This is good.
I do.
I hope I answered your question, Brad, but let's go there.
Yeah,
Where would you like to go?
that was actually very helpful.
No, I'm just wondering where the breadcrumbs are. Do you know what I mean? So I have had people that are suicidal on my table. And they haven't had to say anything because their balance has led me and told me that's where they are. And I'm like, are you suicidal? And they will tell me yes and start bawling. And I'm like, but why? Where's the breadcrumbs that lead to the source of why. And when we get to that source and remove the emotion of that source, all of a sudden they're not anymore. That's been my experience with my own clients. And so what I'm wondering, especially with the children, like, where are the breadcrumbs to the why? Where do they lose themselves? And I know sometimes it can be biochemical, it could be lots of different reasons, right? But like, where it's got a source from somewhere, because I've been there. I've been so dark that I haven't wanted to be here anymore. And I know where my breadcrumbs went. Do you know what I mean? So now I'm wondering, in kids, like, is it bullying? Is it a home life where they're ripped down? Like, where is it? And how can neighbors, stand up for things or be more aware of each other? I don't know. Like, that, I've got so many whys, so many question marks all over the place. Am I making sense?
Yeah, you're making a lot of sense. I think as we consider your question as to the whys, it's going to vary by individual context, their relationships, their emotional functioning, and just their organic nature, just the nature of their bodies physiologically. I would say that as we think about, I like that term, I'll Venmo you the next time I use it in session. I love that. Breadcrumbs. I love that. That's beautiful. I think some of what we might consider here as we look at this idea of breadcrumbs, if there's something that is a common theme among those who are experiencing more than just a down day, we're talking about significant and prolonged sadness and despair, I think it would be hopelessness.
Yes.
An individual would seem, again, to feel like there is no hope, and that the only option that is actually hopeful or promising or would promote peace is an exit. And I've said that a little bit earlier, and I'm just kind of highlighting that terminology again, that someone who dies by suicide is not attempting to take their life, even though that's the logistics of what's happening. But I find so much they just want to be out of pain. And so we have to look at some of those breadcrumbs that you're talking about from pain points, and that is, am I experiencing shame? Do I feel like I'm a hopeless or broken me or damaged me, or I can't show up in the world and unfold in the way that my Creator made me? Or is this something that's much less about shame and much more about, I don't feel like I fit in my family, or my parents treat me poorly.
Yeah.
Or I don't feel like I can measure up financially, and there's just so much pressure that it might be easier to exit. So I think hopelessness is one of those larger breadcrumbs. I think shame is also a larger breadcrumb that is transmissible across cultures. We see it in the mammal kingdoms as well, and we talked about in the last podcast I was here. But we see that as soon as there's a lack of identity in any kind of tribal community, we end up with mental illness of some kind, even among other mammals, where they'll distance and pull away and then engage in other maladaptive behaviors of self-harm. And so I think it's looking at hopelessness, right? And also looking a little more pointedly at the way we're relating to each other.
So just hypothetically, more questions.
Mm-hmm.
So hypothetically, if we were more engaged with each other, do you think people would be more hopeful?
I think if the engagement that you're a part of promotes a lot of connection, I think they would be a lot more hopeful, because there can be those, at least those that I've seen in the office or in the community, that aren't necessarily involved in a professional relationship with me, who are involved with a lot of people, but the relationships are about skin deep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they're not really connecting.
You have a lot of people who you know,
But you don't know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a surface no, not a deep.
Yep.
A deep no.
I know them, but I'm not close to them.
Yeah.
Or, oh, yes, that's Sister Ride. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think some litmus test per what Brad offered there, on some level you would know if you know them. And I think know we could quantify on a variety of different levels here, or we could stratify it as such. But that is, if you move out of that relationship or out of that job or away from that relationship or from out of that community across town a couple miles or out of that LDS ward, for example, at least in this community, and you're not talking, my question is, did you really know them? And I don't know that it's as binary as I just framed it. Do you know them? But how well do you know them? And so I think it can become a pseudo connection to feel like we, quote unquote, to lean on what Brad's teaching here, that we know people, but they can be relationships of convenience, relationships of context in your neighborhood, relationships of context within employment, and you're really lonely, and you may not know it because of these pseudo relationships that are meaningful. I'm not minimizing those. I'm simply saying they're not connective in a way that's going to promote the hope that you're talking about now.
Like actually having a tribe, actually having people that you could turn to when you're dark like that.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you, well, actually, let's ask you, you're the pro. If someone were going dark, what's the best way for a friend to react to that? Like if they're, telling someone, I'm having dark feelings, I'm having dark thoughts, I don't want to be here anymore, that kind of thing. Do you take them at face value? What do? Do you commit them? Do you pink slip them? What?
It's a lot of places to go with that. I'm thinking for a minute and attempting to be mindful. Maybe we could start with what I feel strongly we need not do.
Perfect.
Maybe we could start there.
Okay.
And that is, I think moving into any kind of teaching, or you don't want to do that, or a statement that might promote, or in this case, maybe provoke shame would be, why would you do that? Or what about mom? Or how do you think
makes it worse.
Your daughter would feel? Right.
Yeah.
And so those kinds of questions, while well-intentioned, are harmful, because that's going to encourage more of the pullback emotionally, and maybe even contribute to the hopelessness of the individual that's communicating that and thought that they had enough space in the relationship to do so. So I think teaching in that place is probably not the path to take. But I think where we would go, the more ability or manifestation that you have in that moment of perspective taking, first of all, and that's taking just a moment right in that first iteration that, hey, I've been really down and I've thought this. They may not lead on with, I'm thinking of ending my life.
Yeah.
But I've been so dark now, and I'll role play here for a minute, but just kind of ad lib, but I've just been so dark. I don't know. I've thought things that I didn't ever think I would think. And you might respond with something like, what, tell me what's coming up. And I would say, if I were having some suicidal ideation, I wonder if it's even worth it anymore. And you might put your hand on me then and say, gosh, I had no idea you're struggling that much. I'm so glad you told me. I'm so glad, which is not a response that we typically would give unless we're holding space. If you are glad, if you're not, then you probably wouldn't say that, as that would be disingenuous. But I'm so glad you told me, not how can I help almost immediately, as much as is tell me more.
Yeah. I'm
like, I'm just so overwhelmed with my job in working for the city or in law enforcement, or I'm overwhelmed with my marriage relationship. And sometimes I think about just exiting. I mean, this is typically how the conversation would go. People aren't going to come out and say, I'm thinking of ending my life, typically. So as we consider that, I think it would be prudent to really follow kind of a 4-step pattern. And that is, first, to be listening carefully, and then to be holding space for them, which means we refrain from judgment. We refrain from why kinds of questions. We refrain from keeping our ego in it, wanting to be right, or wanting to inculcate our knowledge upon them about spiritual purported truths about why we would need to live, or what have you. And as we're doing that, we're looking to understand what they're experiencing. And while we refrain from judgment, we're trying to perspective take, like, when have I felt overwhelmed in a job or a marriage or in this, and really sit with them, not just be listening to them, but sit with them in our energy, and then move to a place of really trying to understand what's the emotion for them. Is it sadness? Is it grief and loss? Is it fear? Is it betrayal? What's coming up for them that would lead them, as you talked earlier about these kind of breadcrumbs?
Yes.
What's coming up for them that's going to lead them that way, versus the traditional layperson's going to be thinking, I just need to get them to stop. They need to stop thinking this way, and I need to steer their course. Well, the solution, as we think of influencing them, clearly isn't going to be by steering. It's going to be by perspective taking, refraining from judgment, holding space, keeping your ego out of it, identifying emotion. And then maybe the fifth or sixth thing, I lost track of my numbers there, would be to then communicate that you know what that emotion is. And I might say, Nan, it sounds like you're super overwhelmed and there's a lot of grief. Is that what's coming up? And
So you're validating them.
Mm-hmm.
You're validating what they're feeling. And, you know, I saw I think it was like a human resources thing where someone went into the hole with someone, like someone was dark, feeling depressed. And the way that you get someone out of a hole, a darkness, is you crawl in with them. You go down the ladder and you sit there with them and do exactly what you're talking about, is ask them, listen to them, listen with your heart, not with your ears, not with your mind, but with your heart, and really hear them. And I think that gives hope to them, because for the first time they're heard, you know, and then they feel compassion. And then little by little, you're stepping out of the hole one by one together, instead of being at the top of the hole screaming down, hey, so you're depressed down there. Do you want me to give you some food, or how long are you going to be down there? You know, do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Which most people are like, hands off. I don't want to deal with a depressed person. I don't want to deal with people that have mental illness. Like, do you know what I mean? They kind of just push people aside instead of talk to me. You know, do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So basically that's what I'm seeing with you. Like, be willing to go into the hole with them and sit by them and be like, I mean, and ultimately Christ would do that, right? Mm-hmm. 100%. Anyway, world according to Nan. I know, I'm weird.
Why is that weird?
Just because I saw the cartoon in my head and...
So you had an image associated with a lesson, and that's not weird.
It's a party in my head.
There's nothing weird about that.
But you know what? I try to do that with everyone. Goodness, Rod was getting a colonoscopy the other day, and I love how Nan
overshares. She overshares, like everyone we talk to. Oh, Brad's getting a colonoscopy tomorrow.
I'm super
like
proud.
the people selling fruit down at the corner know all about my colonoscopy.
I'm super proud you have a healthy colon. It's good. No, you don't need another one for 10 years. It's good.
Awesome.
But literally in the waiting room, I mean, he's back there for like 40 minutes, 35, something like that. And I'm getting to know everyone in the waiting room, all of them, like all their stories. You know, one lady went through, chemotherapy. Another one had a mastectomy. Another one, like, I'm getting to know all of them. And by the time they leave, they're asking for my cards and they want to get a hold of me. And it's not because of what I do. It's because I care about people. And you could tell that they were kind of down, or things were happening. I mean, you don't sit in a colonoscopy center because you're happy. Like, they've usually had a really rough night. You know?
Love it.
Well, and I think that's why people are brought to Justin's sessions, because you can tell he cares. He's not just the talking head.
So much.
And he might be, who knows, he might be sitting back there going, it's not my fucking family.
right.
Never know.
He'll even 50 minutes. This is going to be good.
He's like, oh, you're almost done.
You're almost done.
No, we have Justin on here because he's the best. And I've referred lots of people to you, and I will continue to do so. You're really, really good at hearing what is going on and then making a plan to help person. And it's funny because not everyone, like in my business, not everyone's the same. Mm-hmm. And so you have to kind of customize a plan, just like I have to customize a balance, you know, not all answers are the same. And I think it's really cool how you handle each person. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of our family and we're all different. We all have different things going on. So I'm super grateful for your insight. I think it's amazing, but we need to see each other. Bottom line, we need to see each other and help each other in this journey.
And that may be the solution, that idea. Bottom line, we need to see each other.
Yeah.
And I think some of that, if we look deeply into your statement, am I being seen and am I really being known by someone? And I don't know that that's binary. You're either known or you're not. It's how well are you known and how well are you seen? Do you see me? Something that you said earlier I was thinking of and didn't want to interrupt is this idea. You talked about the eyes and the ears, but as you're talking to someone who may be in this particular position, it's considering listening with your eyes, perhaps. Because if we're listening with our ears, we're paying attention to what they're saying, which I think in so many ways is meaningful. but sometimes the truth won't necessarily always be in their words. And so a question in that moment, like, what is Nan telling me she needs right now in this conversation? And you may not have the answer. And if you don't, that's fine. I'm going to continue to listen, at least to my inner knowing in that moment. What does she need? Does she need me to put my hand on her shoulder? Does she need me to keep listening and validating? Does she need me to take a step back? What are the emotions or those breadcrumbs that you talked about that might be coming up? What is coming up for Nan that way that might be facilitating this? And I don't know that we're always going to think this way because we're not in therapy mode. We're just having this discussion. But I think as we slow it down and consider this person, if that's coming to your purview, if they're bringing it to you anyway, they're bidding to connect with you by being vulnerable.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Super interesting.
And if they're not, maybe you're seeing these other symptoms of the withdrawal, of Brad pulling away in the evenings and playing. He's probably not playing Fortnite.
No, he's not a gamer.
He's not a gamer. I was going to say Call of Duty or something. If that were the case, we might be saying, hey, are you feeling okay? As we look at some of the symptoms, which would be, persistent sadness and low mood and a disinterest in things that Brad or you, if you're moving to that place that you thought were pleasurable or enjoyed them before, that you've pulled away from, significant changes in your appetite, either a lot more eating or a lot less, insomnia or sleeping a lot. And we'll see that individuals who are sleeping 12, 13, 14 hours a day pretty consistently, maybe disassociating in an attempt to cope with depression and or suicidal ideation by sleep.
It's a lot easier to just ignore it and go to sleep.
When people check out like that, could that also be people that drown themselves in, checking out different kinds of drugs? So they don't have to be present in their body and they don't have to feel the pain. They just kind of check out.
Yeah, I think dissociative activities that could in so many ways be process addictions or process dependencies, gambling, gaming, consumption of lots of pornography would be ways that you can disassociate. It might be a hyperdependence on independence or work or endurance sports or training. All of those things kind of disconnect us. And while some of the things I just mentioned could be healthy, they pull us away from the things that may be painful.
That's funny because we were talking about running.
We talked about running in our last podcast. Yeah.
Oh, I missed that one. That was probably the best one. I need to listen to it.
Oh, no, it was just one of those things where I said, you know what? I used to run a lot and I was running away. I was going through an ugly divorce. I was going through a change of jobs. I was super depressed and I ran. I just ran, turned on my music and ran and just disassociated, like you said. And you're right. When I had those suicidal ideations, I didn't talk to people about it. I sat in my car in my garage with my shotgun and went, is this going to make that pain stop?
I love you.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
Wow, I took that a wrong turn, didn't it?
No,
you
you didn't.
Dropped it right down.
That was just real. That was just real. But you know what? A lot of us have been there. Been there. And so people that are thinking that way aren't alone. But if there's a way out, we should help each other on the way out. I think Justin's the perfect person to lead us that way.
You're kind.
Yeah, my concern, I'm always going to bring it back to the kids because that breaks my heart. When little kids, are bullied or they're pushed around or mistreated and then they have no hope and then they do that. How do we help? How do we help? How do school teachers, how do principals, how do neighbors, how do people help?
Well, that's a good point because that old adage, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
Anything we can do, I think, that helps us promote in our narrative, in our language, the value of all people and a real resistance and intolerance for defensiveness, disrespect, marginalizing kinds of conversations or statements is helpful within the home and then the greater community in our churches and civic or community groups. And that is to create at least a norm that cyberbullying or shaming or critical statements or behavior are just not tolerated. And it takes individuals, I think, a lot of courage depending on their own fear and the resistance they may get by standing up. I can think of a specific time in my life. This would have been in 1999, actually. And I'll refrain from too many of the details, but I remember saying something in a public setting that was really disrespectful and bigoted, actually. And that statement flowed from a place of ignorance, I think, and fear. And there was a man in my presence. I was in the presence of probably 20 people. And I remember what I said. And I think it was his look at me in that moment. And then the F word, which is so beautiful in so many ways, that I knew we were either on a construction site, which we were not, or which we, that wasn't what was happening. So I knew this probably wasn't us needing to do things differently. It meant there was a real problem in an office setting. But I remember what he said to me in that moment, and the discomfort I felt and the rattling that I received in that moment was so healthy for me. And I've had a lot of years and a lot of growing since that time. But he was unwilling to tolerate my statement. And when Martin Luther King, I don't know where to cite this, but I've committed it to memory because it's beautiful, said, "You begin to die the day you remain silent about things that matter."
Ooh.
And this man wasn't dead. He was standing in the presence of another good man. We'll say good in quotes, Brad, who was speaking out of turn, was speaking in fear and ignorance, and I just got roasted publicly. And I don't remember the combination of words, but I know there were several F words in there, and I didn't have anything to say. It was just, I'm going to stand here, and this is either going to become really physical, or I'm going to learn a lesson. And he gave me some grace, and I learned a lesson. But that is a long story. Back to your question, that is, what can we do as you think of, you referenced this with bullying, and that was, my statement was uninformed and inappropriate. But to that end, he said, "We're not doing that here. Like, you're going to fucking stop right now. Look at me." And he was probably maybe 3 years my senior. And at that point I would have been 24, 25. And it didn't matter. He wasn't in this elderly, he wasn't a father or an uncle or a manager, but it was his lack of tolerance for my demeanor and statement that I hope I've emulated that in some relationships, that I'm growing and that we're all growing together. But I think that's where we need to move as parents, as people. And that's on our watch and in our relationships, in these small little social and emotional incubators. I don't know that we need to be telling people to fuck off in the office settings. But
I don't know. I was just gonna like reiterate. So we're not gonna fucking do that right here.
I know, right?
I think that's our new catchphrase, and we'll Venmo you next time we use it.
But I've had a lot of years to think about that, and that was the only time that happened. But I've thought a lot about the things that he knew and was educated and versed on and expanded on in his own emotional and psychological development that I wasn't. And when he saw that not only was I dismissive, but producing harm, and it was in his context, he put a stop to it. And some of what I said in ignorance, I warranted that response, actually. I look back, and he fought fire with fire. I didn't see it that way in that moment, but I had several days and years to think about it. So that's the answer that's the very long answer to your question.
I love it.
And that is, we have to command our own individual influence and individual authority in spaces where we can create a ripple that allows people to feel whole.
Justin, if people want to grow and get a hold of you, how do they do that?
Yeah, they can look me up online. They can reach out. I can direct them to other resources if I'm not the best fit for them. If it looks like they need Nan, then I would send them that way. If I can be of service, fantastic. For some that say, no, I want a female therapist, I can make referrals that way. If they're in the community, that's fantastic. I'm happy to see them. If they're not, I can help line them up with people that are. if they'd like to be remote or in office, those are always possibilities. I think the invitation, per Brad's question, I think for me is if you're struggling, reach out. As Nan said eloquently earlier, like there are people that are willing to hear you. Your story matters. You matter.
And thank you, Justin, for being on the show. We love having you.
We'll put his information in the show notes with a link to his website, and you can get a hold of him right away.
Yep. And if you'd like to book a reading or a balance with Nan, you can do that through the show notes as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening and joining us here today. We hope that if you are feeling hopeless, remember that you're loved, and we'll see you
On the other side of the veil.